Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be invited to speak to you this afternoon, and thank you for bearing with me during what is quite a difficult time at the moment. But I was really delighted to get the invitation from Joanne Wass, who I've worked with for many years as we transitioned into NHS England. But I was here just a few weeks ago opening the Centre for Biomedical Sciences Research at Leeds Beckett, so I'm pleased to be back so soon. So I'm going to set out really where we are on a journey bringing together genomics and personalised medicine, and what is informing the development of an NHS Personalised Medicine strategy. And we definitely are still in listening mode, and therefore what you have to say today is really important in terms of how we might shape things for the future. But I just wanted to remind us all of some of the challenges that the NHS faces, and therefore really what provides the backdrop for thinking about personalised medicine. And the future for health and care was set out, I think, really succinctly in the 5-year forward view that brought together NHS England with Public Health England and other bodies across the health and care system. And it set out the need really for a greater emphasis on improved prevention, on better integration in terms of provider sectors, but also with social care, with the ability to link data, with data being important to essentially ensure that we treat individuals effectively and efficiently. But in terms of achieving some of the gaps that we've got and that are shown at the bottom part of this slide, is there needs to be new and improved models of delivery. So both new models of care and also improvement of existing models of care if we're really going to cope with the demands from, for example, increases in non-communicable diseases, but also with the financial challenges we face with an increasing demand and yet really a flat line in terms of cash. So 3 main gaps were articulated, which really embodies what you've been considering today. One is the health and well-being gap and the need to reduce those inequalities we've just been hearing about. The second is the care and quality gap, and some of this is because we don't do things that are standardised or industrialised across certainly our integrated healthcare system. And then we know we have this financial gap in terms of what we expect that's needed to provide healthcare in the future, and what, for example, has been the settlement over this current comprehensive spending review. So we're talking about some 20 billion in terms of gaps. Now, what the 5-year forward view did recognise is that science and innovation and disruptive technology was going to be a key part of the change that was envisaged. And these are the 4 solutions that were posed in the 5-year forward view that encompasses some of the things that I've already said. But it also recognises that the NHS needs to be seen as a social movement with a new relationship, not just with patients but with communities, and this enhanced focus on prevention, that we need those new models of care and improvements on existing models of care, but at the right hand side that we really utilise technology and information to best effect. And within that includes large-scale initiatives such as the change and pace in genomics, and that's what I'm going to focus the first part of my talk about. But also the bottom part of this recognises, and this is picked up in George Freeman's Accelerated Access Review, is we've got to get a better compact between the NHS and with industry, so that at the same time as improving health, we also improve wealth. And we've got a better mechanism for bringing in new technologies. But at the top end, the developments that are required in data informatics and connectivity are actually quite huge in themselves in terms of what needs to be done in terms of developing the NHS digital data services platform to something that is fit for the future and can indeed handle the big data challenges that we will face. So a key catalyst for the NHS in thinking about how it uses large-scale initiatives to fundamentally change the way in which care is delivered is epitomised by the 100,000 Genomes project. And this was launched in 2012 by David Cameron. And it was made possible because of the decreasing costs in our ability to sequence all of the genes and all of the genetic material in individuals and couple that with the ability to link that with really big sets of data. Now, the first human genome was reported, and that's looking and mapping the whole human genome, was reported in 2003. It was initiated in the US. It cost nearly $3 billion, and it took 13 years to complete. That was one genome, and 20 countries as international collaborators. Now, whole genome sequencing, so the whole instruction manual for life within an individual can be done and sequenced with it less than a day, costing less than $1,000, and with the ability to bring all of the data together. So it really illustrates the step change, and that's what really drove David Cameron to announce a £3 million investment in this project in 2012. And we're on target really to be able to sequence all the genes, all the genetic material for less than $500, so about £300 fairly soon. But what David Cameron said, and this is a quote taken from here, is by unlocking the power of DNA data, the NHS will lead the global race for better tests, better drugs, and above all, better care. And there's no doubt about it, the NHS, through this project, is really leading the world in terms of being able to integrate genomic technologies as part of routine care, and particularly the use of whole genome sequencing. The 100,000 Genomes project has a focus on rare inherited disease and also common cancer, because those are the diseases with the greatest to gain from looking at an individual's complete genetic material. There are four main aims of this project: to increase the discovery of pathogenic variants, so genetic variants that could lead to the discovery of new drugs, diagnostics and treatment. And already we're seeing in the patients where whole genomes have been sequenced an increased diagnostic yield, so where they've had no known diagnosis and they now have a diagnosis, and that's showing a yield of between 20 and 35% over standard practice. The second, which is really important, is to accelerate the uptake of advanced genomic technologies into the NHS. The third is to increase public understanding and support for the use of genomics. And the fourth is to stimulate and advance the UK life sciences. But one of the key principles is that patients in this project, this isn't a research project, it is and has been approved from ethical approval as an NHS transformational study with a research biorepository of both samples of DNA and other samples that help us understand what that DNA and any alterations in it mean, as well as a large data repository. And participants have had to give their consent for the utilisation of that data. But the understanding is that no information will go outside of safely controlled havens, and all data is de-identified when looked at by others. So this is a fundamental diversion from what is done routinely, and really brings routine clinical care together with research and research endeavour that potentially will drive a new way of working with industry and with researchers for the future. This just summarises the scope of the project. So currently there are over 170 rare diseases, as well as the opportunity to put ultra rare diseases into this category. 3.5 million people live in the UK with a rare disease, so it isn't quite that rare because it's 1 in 15 in the population who have one of these diseases, but they often spend years and years going around the NHS with no diagnosis and with a huge impact on families and within their local community because of that lack of diagnosis. So part of the aims here is to not only increase that diagnostic yield and give them a result, but also to drive some of the new treatments in this area that haven't been there for a very long time. And through the project's also introduced a brand new data set for rare diseases that's not existed before. There are currently 7 common cancers that are being actively recruited to, but with another 7 that are being introduced, which include, for example, testicular, bladder and upper GI cancer. This actually very much fits with the Cancer Task Force recommendations and improving survival in patients with cancer because of the possibility through using whole genome sequencing to understand some of the novel, what are called driver mutations in cancer. And those are the ones that are most likely to be able to have new drugs developed against them, so that we start to move from where we are in some really difficult to treat cancers into a scenario where there are new treatment opportunities. But also what it's throwing up from some of the early results is that some patients with some cancers are eligible for clinical trials that they wouldn't have been eligible from before, just because that level of genetic information was not available. Now, NHS England's strategic decision in terms of how the NHS would contribute to this project as part of routine care was not to hold up the activity or to ask for that activity from 5 well-known centres. It was to look at it from an equity of access for the eligible population across the whole of England, such that we've now created 13 genomic medicine centres across England, each serving around 3 to 5 million people in the population. And by the end of the project, which will be in 2018 now, we expect some 100 hospitals to have been involved in some way in terms of either consenting patients, in collecting samples, collecting data or feedback of results, or taking action on those results. We recently designated in December of last year the Yorks and Humber Genomic Medicine Centre. The lead organisation is Sheffield Teaching Hospitals, but at the end of the project there will be something like 8 to 10 hospitals across this region participating in this project from Yorks and Humber. So across this geography they're establishing pathways that are standardised, that start to address how patients are identified to be eligible for the project, how they can undertake the consenting, how they can supply and process high quality DNA samples, and it's already driven standardised practices across Leeds and Sheffield for both the handling and processing of samples, not only blood samples but also tumour samples across the footprint. How quite extensive data sets can be populated. There are over 1,000 different data fields that have to be populated in the rare disease data set, and over 300 in the cancer data set, more than is routinely collected from cancer. That's having to be put into place to be collected from a raft of different standalone systems across the Yorks and Humber geography and brought together into one location before it is submitted into this project. And what underpins also all of these developments is a parallel workforce development set of arrangements, which has seen through Health Education England the commissioning of a new MSc in Genomic Medicine, which in this region is being offered by Sheffield University. And we've seen to date an unprecedented level of transformation in a relatively short time. I've never seen anything quite like it in any of the NHS projects that I've worked on to date in terms of the mobilisation of staff and the leadership that's being displayed. Now this just summarises how the project all fits together and what it looks like, and I'm telling you this because it really sets out for England how we have the infrastructure to introduce personalised medicine across the NHS in England for the future. These are the 13 genomic medicine centres that I've described. Genomics England has been established as a company owned by the Secretary of State, who's the sole shareholder, and it was established so that there could be some independence for the procurement of different parts of this project, including the procurement of whole genome sequencing from a provider called Illumina, and working with the UK Biocentre to create the sample biorepository, as well as with the Ministry of Defence to create a safe haven for data storage, which is underground in Corsham in Wiltshire. And what this does, after all of this work is done at the top here from routine clinical care, data enters into the safe data space, and it's further populated by data that's pulled out of NHS in England to give a longitudinal record, not just the moment in time record. And then the sequence data is matched together with this clinical data, and then a raft of different analytical platforms are applied so that the pathological significance of any particular genetic mutation can be identified within the individual and between individuals and across the world. At this point, the data becomes research data and is de-identified and can be used by clinicians and academics working together on unanswered research questions or to enhance clinical interpretation for training purposes, and now in a new pre-competitive industry consortium, such that they get access to the data and can start to look at the questions they want to ask to drive drug development. So this is building the future of genomic medicine within the NHS and for personalisation. We have the consistent use now of consent data, the collection of data and samples to high standards and quality for both clinical and research use from the same interaction with the same patient by the same set of clinicians. We've got a legacy pipeline that enables what has been a new sequencing centre to be established in the UK, but also the ability to manage a large-scale data store for sustainability. The concentration of the UK genomics knowledge base has been brought together because other countries of the UK are also participating in this project. And there's been to date £10 million of Treasury money to support the informatics developments, as well as 50 million more over the next 5 years. And then from 2018, NHS England will be commissioning whole genome sequencing for routine care purposes within the NHS. And this is part of the legacy arrangements for the project, as Genomics England are continued through to 2020 to further develop the data store and the UK knowledge base. But what this has started to do through the NHS Genomic Medicine Centres is driven genomic medicine into the NHS, but at the same time has worked very closely with patients who've streamlined not only the consent and some of the ethical dimensions that are emerging, but also streamlined patient pathways for the future. So what is it we're going to do, having put this legacy set of arrangements in place and still delivering an active project which will see the NHS commit or deliver 90,000 whole genomes into this project, as we want to use it to drive a move from illness to health, from something where in the NHS we focus on a delayed diagnosis, late stage disease, on fairly restricted treatment and management options, and where if we recognise that only of our current treatments available, only 30 to 60% of them are effective. So there's a large set of patients who receive treatments who aren't necessarily effective. We have 1 in 15 hospital episodes associated with adverse drug reactions. On the right-hand side, we want to use science and technology to provide a more prognostic health service, to diagnose disease earlier, to be able to influence lifestyle factors and options, and drive stratified medicine. And this is really part of what's called the 4 Ps of personalised medicine, of prediction, more precise diagnosis, more personalised and targeted interventions, and a more participatory role for patients at the very beginning. So coming back to one of those main pillars of the solutions for the NHS. So last September, the NHS England board approved the development of a personalised medicine strategy for the NHS in England. We recently had another discussion with our board, and we will start to introduce some areas that for significant improvement over the next year that builds a personalised medicine approach into that. It will build upon what we've learnt from the 100,000 Genomes project, but also the fact that we've got other cutting-edge diagnostics available in the NHS. And we're in the only health system in the world that has the ability to link patient and clinical data in the way that we can. The reason why this is of such interest is we currently spend £8 billion on diagnostics in the NHS in England and £13 billion on drugs. So if we can get the two of those things working better and to better effect and to change the burden of disease and the outcomes for patients, we should really, there's a reason for doing this. We've defined personalised medicine, and it's really an evolution from what William Osler said over 100 years ago. It's an evolution in terms of medicine. So it's a move away from a one-size-fits-all approach to something that uses all the current emergent technologies to better manage patients' health and to target therapies to achieve the best possible outcomes. And so it encompasses stratified medicine, precision medicine, and all the other terms that are utilised in this space. This is what's seen as the benefits of personalised medicine. One, it will enable us to take a much more targeted approach to disease prevention and to develop a much more stratified and integrated approach with Public Health England than we've had to date, including through the identification of a number of predisposition markers or underlying processes to improve future disease detection. One, it will enable us to detect disease much earlier, some 2 to 8 years before we currently do and before symptoms are obvious. Thirdly, it will provide us with the opportunity to accelerate diagnosis and make one that's much more scientific, based on underlying cause rather than on a group set of symptoms, to give much more targeted therapy, and that therapy isn't all going to be about new therapies. Some of that, as we're seeing in the 100,000 Genomes project, may be dietary changes only. It may be repurposed, fairly low-cost medications. But what we know is if we get it right, we'll be able to improve outcomes. And that's not just morbidity and mortality, but to improve the quality of care for patients and our populations. And at the very top, we should, in doing this, and from some of the economic analyses we've done today, we should be able to provide the efficiencies and the savings that the NHS needs. So this is what is at the core of our personalised medicine strategy in England. So it builds from recognising we are participating in the 100,000 Genome Project, and we will have whole genome sequencing for the future in the NHS, not just in the diseases that it's focused on at the moment, but much more broadly. But as you've heard this morning, that there are other parts of what is called the functional genomics pathway that we need to look at, such as looking at proteins and other biomarkers that circulate in the blood that really help us understand what any genetic variation mean here in terms of the expression within an individual. And it's those type of, for example, rather simple biomarkers that will enable us to proper stratify treatment. So there's a piece in here of linking this all together with the functional parts of the genomics pathway to understand what this genetic change makes. Matching that with all of our other diagnostic data from pathology, imaging and physiological sciences, with the ability to use informatics and digital health in an integrated healthcare system, and with the developments in NHS Digital that are proposed, to provide an integrated phenotypic characterisation, but recognising the really advances in wearable applications and other data that patients themselves can generate that need to be built into this that previously we wouldn't have thought about doing. But what we know is, around the edge of this slide, that we've got to make sure we align our system, including the new regulatory arrangements that will be coming in terms of EU devices and the Device Directorate. We've got to have a much more agile and responsive commissioning system than we've got at the moment, and something that can respond, but also without the perverse incentives that we have in some parts of it. We also need to further evolve the informatics system, but because this will fundamentally change what is called the taxonomy of medicine, how we understand and group disease, this will require new clinical change models and a whole raft of work around clinical leadership. And we'll need to bring to bear all of the new technological advances and to promote our knowledge base. So that includes some of the point of care testing devices. So this is it really in a nutshell. And over here, what it recognises, these are different body systems in here. And by taking a more genomic approach, matching it with our ability to understand the functioning of organ body systems through other diagnostics, recognising the importance of environment and other social determinants in our health, as well as known drug responses, we should be able to vertically integrate this through our informatics developments and through the genetic understanding of the genetic variation and what it means in an individual, to horizontally integrate that across our body systems. So it will enable us to start to classify diseases, for example, on the basis of their inflammatory or immune phenotype, rather than that necessarily occurring within a particular organ and not thinking about another organ. But by doing that, that will enable us to really understand which drugs will cause adverse drug reactions in an individual or which ones will be efficacious. And so that's really what this is showing you here, with different drugs for different patients or at different doses, and moving from a one-size-fits-all to an individually tailored approach. But what the evidence is showing us is that whilst it will drive new drugs, whilst it might actually drive us towards some of the more expensive drugs, it is actually going to give us the ability to look at what we've got already and use that more effectively, or sometimes to repurpose those. But in some patients, it will be a non-pharmacological intervention. It will be a lifestyle change, for example. And I often describe this now as this being a more scientific approach to diagnosis. So the diagnosis being more scientific and our drug therapy being matched in a much more scientific way. So What we have to think about in terms of the future, and this is what our early opportunities will be, we have to think right back at near patient testing out in primary care, right through to what we can need to bring together at a level of aggregation in the system because of what the technology is showing us. What we will be looking at over the next 6 months and introducing in the planning guidance next year for NHS England are some early wins linked to clinical priorities for the system, such as in cancer, such as in mental health, or in learning disabilities, or in maternity and child health. We know there's a significant variation exists, for example, in patient response in monogenic diabetes. We've known that for a long time. We haven't tackled that systematically across the system. We actually just heard about coronary heart disease in Birmingham, and it's interesting because now across the West Midlands they're going to be introducing testing, genetic testing and other testing, starting from a population base for familial hypercholesterolemia that we know is a significant cause of coronary heart disease and death in the under 50s, especially in the undiagnosed population, and this affects 1 in 250 in the population. So this is going to be a primary focus for NHS England in the future, and also something where we're working on with Public Health England. And over here, we know there's significant adverse reactions to warfarin therapy. And such, the use of other novel agents of anticoagulant therapy called NOACs are being prescribed. And the costs of prescribing NOACs have increased. Yet we know if we do genetic testing, then warfarin can be used more safely in some patients, but it's not being introduced systematically. And so this is everything on the right-hand side that we'll be doing to introduce this, but we'll be introducing what are relatively simplistic genetic testing, whilst at the same time looking for 2018 at where we'll introduce whole genome sequencing. And the debate here is what we will do in cancer, and by that time we may be introducing cancer gene panels more systematically across the NHS, or even whole genome sequencing. What's going to be important for the future as we drive forward personalised medicine are these academic partnerships, not only from things like the Diagnostic Evidence Collaborative that you heard about this morning, but all the other innovations. But what's critical to this is the integration between academia, between the NHS, between industry, and most importantly at the centre, between our patients. If we get this right on the right-hand side, we should be able to speed up the innovation and the adoption and spread within our health service to give better effects to our patients. I just want to finish by saying this is all raising at the moment is the whole ethical front line of scientific advance and how far the science should really go in terms of thinking about a sustainable healthcare system for the future. And indeed, in the discussions we've had over the last 9 months, the question of whether we should be performing whole genome sequencing at birth has been raised, so that one can generate a stratified risk profile, a pharmaceutical genomic profile, and then really match that with the type of interventions that can happen. What's been interesting is the views of the millennial generation is quite different to different other groups within society. And I think we have to think about everyone in society when we start to have these ethical debates. So I think we are on the step towards a better future, towards an approach where we can systematically introduce all elements of genomics into the NHS and use that for patient and population benefit. There's an opportunity, I think, to bring clinical practice and research together with the data infrastructures and with the ability to collect samples to high quality within routine clinical care that we haven't had before, that will enable new partnerships with industry, but also enable patients to be empowered in a new way. And I think what we have to all recognise is there will need to be a shift in mindset, and this is going to be iterative and developing. And just to finish, and something that George Freeman, the Minister for Life Sciences, often says is, this is really the UK's moonshot moment. We currently are, whether it's participating in the 100,000 Genomes project or in terms of the plans for personalised medicine, this is pushing forward new frontiers, and there is nowhere else. And certainly I've listened to many talks across the world and reviewed lots of the literature. There's nowhere else that's doing it like this, and where we have the ability to bring academia together with the NHS, together with social care, and together with our patients. So thank you very much.
Thank you.